Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Q&A session. So hopefully everyone can hear us. Please message in the box if you're joining us online and you can't hear. So we just had a nice screening show of a film that was The Atom, a Laugh Affair, and now we are moving on to the Q&A with the director. And just for the benefits of everyone who haven't been here with us in person, I will introduce our guest again. So the director, Vicki Lesley, and she's been working in the documentary for over 20 years and developed and produced top-rated and award-winning TV shows that was broadcasted on the BBC, Channel 4, Channel 5, and Discovery, National Geographic. And she also directed independent short films, which have been screened at the festivals around the world and online. And this film that we've just watched today and will be available for people who have not been joining us for later today. So that's her debut feature documentary, and it was released back in 2020. And I think right now we are ready to start the Q&A session. So if you have your chat and you're joining us online, please put this in the box and we will address it. I think I would like to open this conversation by raising a question. So in your documentary, there was these 4 countries that was featured. Yes. And which of the 4 countries do you think handled this program of getting us into the nuclear power in the best way? And what do you think you have learned from this experience of making this documentary?
Well, that's 2 big questions. The first one, I don't know really about handled it in the best way. I mean, I guess the reason I included the different countries, well, I didn't start out doing that. I mean, I'm in the UK, I'm British, and so I initially started looking at the story here. And I actually took the film to some sort of documentary markets in Europe when we were trying to raise funding for the film. And it was sort of some European, broadcasters and sales agents and people who encouraged me to look more at the European story. And the more I did that, it all sort of happened in concurrently, really. But as the more I was learning about the history, and then I started reading more about the different countries, I sort of got more and more interested in the sort of politics around the atom and the peaceful atom. I didn't so much look at the weapons side of things. But sort of what struck me was, nuclear power is nuclear power is nuclear power. It's the same technology in all those different countries, but it's had such a different experience. So sort of why was that? And that was kind of the thread that I was pulling on. So I don't know that you can really answer which one's done it best, because I think it's what's happened in each country is reflective of what those countries are like. So one of the things that I've often found really interesting is hearing people in America talking about France as though you could sort of lift what happened in France into the American context. And I just don't think you could. Like, America is a completely different, politically, a completely different sort of country and setup. So I don't know. I mean, I guess they've all sort of played. I mean, somebody did say, I forget who it was. I did something like, I've recently totted them up because the Nucleus archive up in Scotland maybe are interested in taking my interviews to go into their archive, which would be amazing, because I've just got so much footage. Like, the first edit of this film was 4.5 hours. I've got way more. I was making it for 10 years. I've just got so much more than I could possibly go into this film. But I added up, I think it's something like 65 interviews, and most interviews are a couple of hours long. So I mean, there's just so much footage, or interview footage. But somebody said to me along the way about the UK that we were sort of particularly kind of just bumbling and sort of made lots of, politically sort of, and that was one of the things I remember being really interested in early on. I got sort of obsessed with lots of little, detours in the story that I went up, that in the end, in this final film, had to be just trimmed back because you can't include everything. But one of the things that I was very interested in quite early on was how Britain and France took completely different, in the 60s, took completely different view on the American, the pressurized water reactor. And if knowing nothing about nuclear, but knowing about Britain and France, I would have assumed it would have been Britain who would have gone for the Americans' reactor and France who didn't. But in fact, it was the opposite. We in the UK sort of carried on with our gas reactors, which I'm not no scientist, but from my lay understanding, like they weren't bad reactors. It was just it's a different path, and it seemed to be a bit of a dead end in terms of, the PWR was the one. I guess it's a bit like VHS and Betamax. The PWR was the one that ended up being the one that took off. I'm sort of rambling off. Sorry about which one that I thought did best. I don't know that I could answer that really. Nuclear, it's not that it's neutral, but it's this technology that we, as society and sort of in a political context, we bring our own political sort of context to it. So probably each country has gone the way that it could have done it, given the context of where it was at. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you. I think we have one question that might actually work very well as a follow-up for this. So Catherine George is asking, what lessons do you think nuclear fusion power could learn from the mistakes and successes of the fission?
Oh, wow. That's kind of a big question. Well, I don't know. I mean, nobody can predict the future, can we? That's one of the things that I thought was interesting, as I looked into the story. So many things that had a very big impact on kind of the direction of travel for fission, were in a way not really things to do with nuclear power. The oil crisis was nothing to do with nuclear power, but it had this very big impact in France. And, that was a case in point, really. Both countries responded to the oil crisis and said, well, actually, a really great way to deal with our dependency on oil is to move to nuclear. But Americans didn't manage to do it in the same way because of those political issues. So I don't know. I mean, forecasting is a real issue. Maybe it is. I mean, maybe I would say this because I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm not a social scientist or any kind of scientist, but, my interest in it, I guess, is the people and the structures and everything. And maybe, I don't know, the people who are thinking about fusion, if there's a way to, I don't know that there is a way, because you don't know, you can't predict the future, but if there is a way to think about that political context and take it into account more when thinking about how things might develop. I mean, I'm not sure that is possible. If people could do that, the world might be in a different place, but I don't know. Does that answer the question? These are hard questions.
For me, it was really interesting seeing the parallels from what was happening then to the issues that we're facing today. So, like the oil crisis, you mentioned, like petrol is pretty.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of annoying, isn't it, in a way that suddenly all this stuff has happened. I was saying to somebody earlier, there's always been an issue. When do you stop the story? I just stopped the story because I've been doing it for 10 years. You have to draw a line under it at some point. But like now, I'm like, oh God, it's like the wheel is turning again and more stuff is happening. I mean, I can't just keep on making this film forever and ever, but you're completely right. Like what's going on now is really fascinating in the ongoing context of that story that we've just seen.
And do you think from what you have documented that we could have another resurgence because that's what drove the initial kind of interest in nuclear?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know this. I feel like I went through this whole big journey myself in making it of different thinking. Like I'd sort of understood, I'd got to the nub of the story, and then actually I changed my mind. But I do think a lot. I do keep coming back to the sort of economic stuff, and you can look at it both ways, can't you? I mean, in terms of what's going on right now, it's been very difficult economically certainly in Britain and America. But I don't know. I mean, we've got to get off fossil fuels. Hopefully we all agree about that. But, I mean, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see, isn't it? One of the things that have been striking, Boris Johnson's fairly recent announcement, I'd sort of forgotten when we watched it again, is that Gordon Brown had announced those 8 nuclear power stations. I think it was 2008. And that's coming up for 15 years ago, and Boris Johnson has effectively just announced the same 8 nuclear power stations now. So it's not for lack of political desire to do it, and we're building Hinkley, but the rest of those 8 power stations have not, and Hinkley is not, it's not operating yet. So I don't know, that it's obviously difficult to get them going. And the other thing, I suppose, is the sort of external context. you know, there's lots of stuff, it's sort of outside of my expertise really, but, you know, stuff around the grid and where nuclear fits in a changing grid, and, you know, the SMRs, and, you know, that there's lots going on, isn't there? So I don't know, it seems to me like politically the economics seems to be the big sort of sticking point. But then, I don't know, you know, things can change really quickly, can't they? So it's very, I don't know. I was just said is forecasting is a sort of fool's game, so I don't want to. I won't try and forecast, but I don't know. It would be interesting to see. We all keep on following this story that's not stopping, is it?
Right. Let's take another question.
Yeah.
Yes, sort of related to my last one actually. I was wondering, specifically in Germany, they've got a very strong sort of anti-nuclear sentiment.
Yeah.
How do you think that will be affected by the recent business with Russia cutting off their gas supply?
Well, yeah, I don't know. And that all of that was
the point in the film that Americans were very worried about their energy independence.
Yeah.
That same thing.
Yeah. That was something. The whole Germany thing was something that was really interesting to me, because and France, but I don't feel like we hear that much. We hear a lot about America, you know, but we don't hear nearly so much about certainly the sort of social context. And there was I had to leave so much of it out, but the kind of, even going back to the immediate post-war times, the sort of that anti-civil nuclear, there was a real sort of separation in Germany that maybe didn't happen in so much, or demarcation between civil nuclear power and military nuclear power. West Germany, as it was then, you know, was completely forbidden from having the nuclear weapons. And also, you know, the scientists were very keen to separate themselves. And the anti-nuclear sort of sentiment in the very early days had some sort of right-wing, sort of small c conservative stuff that then was later in the 70s in a way kind of superseded by, I guess, the more stereotypical, you know, anti-nuclear feeling that arose in Germany, and in other countries. I mean, that was something I had to, I had to do a lot of oversimplification in the film, and there was, you know, it's obviously not the case that there was a lot of anti-nuclear feeling in France, particularly in the 70s. There was also a lot of support for nuclear in Germany, and I had all of that in this early version. And, you know, in the end, we had to kind of, for clarity, you know, we sort of made France the pro-nuclear and Germany the anti-nuclear, but that's a massive oversimplification. But I suppose to answer about Germany, I mean, from everything that everyone there that I met, and you know, they were from different, you know, we got the German Green guy who was an anti-nuclear protester, and then you've got the head of Siemens Energy. You know, I had as much as I could manage a sort of spectrum, but they were all very clear. I mean, I should say these interviews were done mostly quite a long time ago now, sort of between 2013 and 2015. The film itself was basically finished in 2017, and then there was a couple of years of trying to raise money to clear all this archive footage. So actually now, you know, it's the wheel has turned quite a lot more. So it would be interesting. I'm not up to date with where things are now, but my sense was that the anti-nuclear feeling in Germany was much more sort of across the political spectrum, and everyone seemed to be telling me that it was just much more. It's not a debate in Germany. You know, it's just not. They've kind of just, I mean, I don't know. I was hoping to get out to Germany this year because this is the year of the phase out, but I just, you know, haven't. There's just me. I mean, I have a distribution company, but they released the film in 2020. They've kind of, they've sort of moved on from it now, really. And, you know, I'm only working part-time, so I haven't managed to get out there, but I would love to, because exactly as you raise, I mean, it'd be really interesting to know. I think there was certainly in the last German election campaign, there was, I think, some discussion, wasn't there, about maybe postponing this phase out this year. But then I think that has not happened, but I'm not, you guys, there might be people here who are more up to speed on that than me, but yeah, I don't know, I'm waffling, sorry.
So obviously you spent a really long time making this, and I'm guessing you've seen loads and loads of interviews. Did you find your own personal opinion on nuclear shift?
Yes, completely. Yeah, completely. And the biggest thing I would say was just, in a way, was what really influenced that the sort of love affair metaphor was quite a late addition. There that came when we were editing. It was one of those things, like trying to remember exactly when we first had the conversation. But, you know, my editor and I were sort of talking about how we could just kind of put a net over really this enormous big story with all the different countries in so many years. And whether it was me or him that first had the idea of this love affair thing. And then I went away and started trying to kind of map it on. And, you know, one or two of the reviewers thought that it was, I'd kind of put, I mean, clearly I've pushed the metaphor to sort of within an inch of its life, but I hoped I did that in a sort of humorous way. Like, I'm aware that I'm doing that, you know.
I thought it was really good.
Oh, thank you. But where that came from absolutely was really from doing the interviews. And I suppose the sort of stereotype would be that, you know, the anti-nuclear people are the more emotional people. And actually Spencer Wirt, who's in there, who wrote a really great book called, the original book was called, I think it was just called Nuclear Fear. And then he reissued it after Fukushima. But I would look him up, Spencer Wirt, W-E-A-R-T. It's a really, really interesting book. I nicked a lot of my ideas from him, really. But I remember him saying, like, there's no sort of pro-nuclear songs, you know, like it's the anti-nuclear people sit there with their guitars and, you know, doing the songs. That pro-nuclear people do reports and, you know, facts and figures. And I got very sort of obsessed with this like dichotomy, really. But then when I went and sat down, and because obviously most of the people I was talking to, or maybe not most, but many of the people I was speaking to were nuclear people. That was a really important thing for me. I didn't want to just talk to kind of commentators. I wanted to tell, you know, it wanted it to be people who were actually had experienced this story in some capacity. So a lot of people had spent their whole working life in nuclear, whether it was actually in the industry or in, you know, the political regulation or whatever. And a lot of them were sort of quite elderly men. And when I was doing most of the interviews, particularly on the American filming trip, I was 6 months pregnant, and I felt like it was this very sort of stereotypical me going in with my big sort of pregnant bump and these sort of old white men. But then actually when we sat down, I just found that they were really emotional about it. But some of them found that really interesting, because I was asking a lot of questions about emotions and how they sort of felt about nuclear, and sometimes they really didn't want to. They were like, why are you asking me about that? You know, or they just didn't even really, they sort of couldn't really answer those questions. It was just not how they'd ever thought about it. But yeah, once we sort of thought about that actually there's a lot of, I guess I was very interested in the politics and the social context that we talked about, but also I was really interested in the psychology. Like I said before, you know, nuclear is nuclear, but how come some people think it's like the worst thing ever and some people think it's amazing? I mean, it's also true that some people don't really think much about it one way or the other, but you know, it is one of those subjects that some people have very strong views about. So like, why is that? And that was what I was drilling into, I suppose. Does that? I can't even remember what your first question was. Sorry, I just got to witter away.
It's a big piece of work.
Yeah.
A long time. Look with both sides. It doesn't feel like too much of an agenda there. You said you're not a nuclear scientist.
No.
Where
yeah, well, it was just so random when I look back. It was actually 2006. So I was working in TV in, you know, sort of factual programs, factual entertainment, and I was sort of coming up to turn 30. And I look back, I was having a little sort of crisis of my life. You know, what was I doing with my life? And I was working on a lot of, this was like the mid-noughties. It was, I don't know, there's been a bit of a reappraisal of that period of time I've noticed lately of the media of that time. But, you know, I'd worked on a program about ASBOs, if you remember, those antisocial behaviour orders, that was very kind of laughing at people with mental illness, I think. Really, I'd worked on something about plane crashes. I did another documentary that was about people sleeping with their au pairs. Like, I don't know, I was kind of like, I had this idea of making documentaries, you know, about important things in the world, and I wasn't quite doing that, and I was having this little crisis. So I kind of was like, I'm just going to go off and make a film on my own. And I look back at that idea. It took me, you know, well over 10 years to make this film. I had really no notion of what I was doing, and I was just talking to a friend of mine, sort of saying, I think I'm going to go off and do something on my own, but I don't, you know, what shall I do something about? And it was literally just like, it was in the news at the time. It was around that time, you know, it's in the film, Blair gave that speech to the CBI, that nuclear was back on the agenda with a vengeance. And it was, I mean, I was like a child in the 80s, so I remember Chernobyl kind of as a kid. and it was just, I don't even know really, like look back, for whatever reason I was interested in that, and I thought, oh, I could make a documentary that would be part of this debate. Like I had no idea it was going to take me 10 years to do it. And there was obviously moments when I just thought, oh, I've missed the moment, you know, like the film was still not finished, but you know, it's hopefully it's still, we're here today in 2022 and it's still kind of relevant. And the great thing was, I suppose, luckily for me, is I never got kind of bored of it. Like I feel like nuclear power is just a really interesting way to look at loads of other things. Lots of things that I you know, was and still am really interested in. So yeah, I just never, luckily, so I never got bored of it. But I mean, if I'd have known in 2006, I don't think I would have made a decision to say, yes, I'm going to spend the next sort of 12 years making a documentary about nuclear power. I'm not sure I wouldn't have done that. But I mean, I'm really glad I did, because it was, and I'm still, you know, I'm still interested in reading books. And you mentioned that book that I hadn't read. I was like, oh, why haven't I read that? You know.
Apologies, it's not too relevant. This was so attached in the documentary. We saw, you know, how the situation in Fukushima almost acted as a bit of a death sentence to any possible revival of Germany, regardless of how feasible it was. But wondering, how did that impact on the Japanese perception onto nuclear power after the incident, after it happened on?
Yeah,
I don't know how it's touching any of the interviews.
Not really. I mean, I would have loved, my brother actually lives in Tokyo, and I desperately sort of wanted to go to Japan and include it. And I just couldn't raise the money. And also, I think it was just probably like a perspective too far, really. Like I already had 4 countries and 7 decades and stuff. So the honest answer is I'm not too sure. I mean, I know one of the reasons I was really keen before Fukushima, I had really wanted to go out there, because I'd seen they had some amazing, and I think they all closed down after Fukushima, but they had some amazing sort of like visitor attractions. Like they were almost like theme parks. They just looked incredible. And I would have loved to go. I mean, I think they've all closed down now, but I think there was just this real like enthusiasm pre-Fukushima. I mean, I don't know really is the answer to that. Maybe other people can answer that. I don't know.
Yeah, another one. What was the biggest challenge for you when you were making
Oh, it was raising the funding. Yeah, completely. And just, I don't know, raising the funding completely, but also, I guess, sort of convincing that my film is, well, maybe this has changed a little bit in the last few years, but it's quite unfashionable approach really to, it's a very, you know, it's a big overview. It's much more fashionable to sort of take, you know, a person or like one small story that goes very deep into something, and that's just not what I wanted to do. Like I wanted to tell that big sort of, you know, overview story, but that was very, very hard to get the funding for. I mean, there was also, obviously there's kind of logistical challenges of just traveling around. Yeah, it was mostly the funding. I mean, actually making the film, some people have asked me at other Q&As of how I got people to take part. But I mean, there was no rocket science. I mean, I just emailed people and asked them, and generally everybody said yes. I mean, the one except, well, there was 2 exceptions to that, and they were both very, very old people. One was Mike McCormack, who is the was sadly already, several people in this film have passed away because, you know, we're looking at stuff from a long time ago. But he was the congressman in the 70s and on the House Energy Committee, and I was trying to find if he was still alive, and I found somebody by his name in a retirement community in Oregon, and I just wrote a letter in the post saying, like, I don't know if you are this Mike McCormack, and if you're not, like, sorry, and if you are, this is what I'm doing, and I'd love to speak to you. And I got he emailed me from, you know, somebody's email at the community place, and we went. That was a very funny interview because he was very, very deaf, and he just literally couldn't hear the frequency of my voice. So he could hear my cameraman, who was a man who had a deeper voice, but he just couldn't hear me. So, but for the sort of the eye line of the interviews, you know, he sat and was talking to me, but his wife sort of had to sit behind me, and I would say the question, and it was very odd for him as well. I think he had to answer the question to me, but I would say the question and then she would say it again. And sometimes she sort of didn't really ask the same question that I'd asked, and that was very odd. And then he took me on a, you know, he was delighted to show us around his retirement community, and he sort of took me on a tour, but he just couldn't really hear me. But it was amazing, you know, to get his perspective, because that was right back into the 70s. I mean, he had worked at Hanford in the 50s, you know, he was like real pure history. And then the other one was Marcel Boiteau, the director of EDF, who was also in his 90s when we interviewed him. And I was trying to find if he was still alive. I mean, a lot of the people that, when I was researching, I would look and think, oh, I really want to speak to so-and-so person, and then I would find their obituary. You know, it's just, that's what the nature of looking at film from lots of decades ago. But I couldn't find an obituary of Marcel Boiteau, and I thought he was quite a significant person, that there would be an obituary if he had died. Also, I just don't have that level of French. You know, I did like GCSE French, so I hired a researcher who spoke French and German, and he found him. It's amazing. He was, I think, 92 or 93, and he still had an office at EDF and his own secretary. And so my researcher got in touch with him through there, and then he tracked him down, and I was literally about to go on maternity leave with my first baby. And I was so worried because he was very old. I was just, you know, I was worried that he might not still be alive by the time my maternity leave finished. So I sent off the researcher and the translator that we'd used. I had already done some French filming before that. And then my son was 3 weeks old, and I sent off a film crew to Paris with like my questions, and they did the interview. So that was, I suppose, apart from the money, like the challenge of finding and sometimes dealing with like really elderly people. But, you know, I'm really glad I did it. I went to a really interesting nuclear heritage conference up at Sellafield a few weeks ago. And, you know, already like the earliest years people, like most of them have already died. We're losing people all the time. You know, that's one of the reasons I think why Nucleus are interested in my interviews. And I hope it'd be fantastic if we can get them in there, because, you know, these are stories that are, you know, they're just going to disappear otherwise. And hopefully I asked some slightly different questions as well. Like I asked, you know, about their lives or what it felt like to do their job or whatever. So, those stories are going to go if we don't capture them soon.
Kind of a follow-up from that. So obviously you've got all your interviews and the documentary itself, but is anyone else doing anything to kind of maintain that knowledge so it doesn't get lost? Well,
so yeah, there's how the thing at Sellafield came about was I just one day saw on LinkedIn a post by the nuclear heritage lead at Sellafield, and I was like, what? Like, I didn't know there was a heritage lead at Sellafield, and there wasn't when I was making the films then. That made me feel better that I hadn't just completely missed this. But yeah, he's only in the last, I think, 2 years taken on this post, and he's, I highly recommend following him on LinkedIn. It's called Philip Greatorex, and he is sort of doing like a one-man campaign, really. He's interviewing people. The first post that I saw was a whole tranche of films that were made. So the UKAEA in the very early decades employed this sort of small local, I don't know if they were local, but a small film company, just to document the operations at what's Windscale and Calder Hall. And I mean, I think he died a long time ago, but his son, a family member anyway, basically had kind of found all these original films, this whole collection, and not just the films, but all of his notes from making the films and things. And they've donated them to Sellafield with the proviso that it all be kept together. And yeah, he's trying to do lots of interviews, but it's like all these things, it's trying to raise funds to capture this stuff. So the event I was at in Cumbria, they had somebody from the NDA there. And I think there is a new sort of clause in there that I think it's something like a cultural, that they do have to sort of take some account of this cultural stuff. It's a drop in the ocean, obviously, in terms of the budget of the NDA. But it's one of those things that can easily get lost, and literally lost. If some of these people that I interviewed, Mike McCormack, nobody had spoken to him about his work, you know, as a nuclear chemist and in politics about any of this stuff for years, and he was just sort of couldn't believe that this random English woman had written to him, and you know, he was delighted to talk to me. And I'm sure that there's, you know, I mean, I've volunteered, you know, if they do get the funding, I just think it would be, you know, these, and like the Bradwell, all those guys that I interviewed at Bradwell, it was just so interesting. Some of the stuff that was so interesting to me about that was, in a way, not even really about nuclear power per se. It was more about just that time, that period when, you know, the CEGB was this really prestigious place to work, but also it was just like a really fun, it was also a really great place to work. You know, there was lots of stuff that we didn't include in the film, but, you know, they talked about doing floats in the local carnivals, and they were really involved in their community. And it was just like, I don't know, like in terms of the employment of that time, whatever, we've completely lost that, like that mid-century kind of technological optimism, but also a sort of social, I don't know, the sort of social arrangements, you know, with that type, you know, that world has kind of gone really. So yeah, hopefully we can capture some of these stories before they're all, you know, and getting, you know, stuff in people's attics. I'm sure, I mean, that was the other thing that was a big job for me doing this, which I largely did on my own. I did hire an archive producer later on, dealing with the more, like the actual broadcast footage. But a lot of stuff, particularly in this country, because of privatization, a lot of stuff from the CEGB, a lot of films have just completely gone, like nobody knows where they are. I would read about things, and sometimes I'd find them on YouTube. But the video I've got from after Chernobyl that the CEGB made, that I've just got, it's a VHS that I found on eBay, and I bought it on eBay, and no, like as far as we know, no one else has a copy of that, and it's like really terrible quality, and obviously didn't really want to put it in the film off of a VHS, but we just couldn't find it anywhere else. And you know, I think there have been some academics who've been looking into it, but I think a lot of it is lost. And you know, that's one thing where another thing, we've done much worse on that than in America. You know, the American film archive is amazing, and it's all in the public domain. You know, it's really well catalogued by the Library of Congress. It's really well preserved. The footage from the 50s in Japan, the Atlas for Peace conference, like I couldn't believe it when I got that. It's just this incredible, you know, 35mm color film that's been completely preserved. I contacted them, they had it, they did a copy for me, they sent it to me. Like, it's all just, whereas here it's like, it's really random. And, you know, probably there's bits and pieces in people's attics, or, you know, I don't know, well, probably not even in an office somewhere, because it's kind of changed ownership so many times. So I don't know. Yeah, hopefully we can capture some of this stuff. I've tried to do my bit in the film. Do you have any more questions?
Just wondering, so I mean, part of the emotional response to the objection to nuclear power is bound up in that kind of parallel with the bombs.
Yes.
And you see, you know, there's the nuclear power plant, but it only has to go out of control, and then you've got the nuclear bomb. But then at the height of the Cold War, and in films like Threads and When the Wind Blows, the weapons we're actually worrying about there are fusion bombs. And I'm just wondering why nuclear fusion gets a much easier right in this respect. When what they're doing in nuclear fusion is an uncontrolled.
I don't know. I wonder if it's just maybe people just don't really know. Like, people don't really know what nuclear fission is, do they? To be honest, like, and they probably really don't know what fusion is. No, it's a very good point. Lily Cole, actually, who narrates the film, she is really interested in fusion. She had, one of the reasons I think she was happy to narrate the film was she had a book that came out, I think the same year the film came out, where she went, and it was, I think it's called, I was not to say Reasons to be Cheerful, it's not called that, but it's a kind of, you know, like technological reasons to be optimistic about in the face of the climate crisis, basically. And she had a chapter on nuclear, and fusion had reached, I think she'd been to, is it, what's it one in Oxfordshire? Yes. She was really interested in that, and she was asking me questions about that, which I was totally ill-equipped to answer because I didn't really look at fusion. But it is a really good question. Like, that's the thing. I think a lot of people's responses to things are not always responses to the actual thing, in a way. Like, they're like, that's the thing. That one of the, you know, my little hobby horses was that actually what you think about nuclear power is probably much more to do with sort of you than it is to do with nuclear. And I was aware of that myself, you know, like when I went into those interviews with my big pregnant bump, and I'm a sort of, you know, lefty artsy sort of, and woman, you know, like, and they were older, you know, more authority kind of facts and, you know, all the sort of stereotype stuff. I don't know, you can slightly, I don't know, fall down a rabbit hole of sort of being a bit too meta about everything. But yeah, it's one of the things I feel is missing often in the discourse around nuclear. That is often just a kind of, it feels like this competing list of sort of facts without, like, it's not that facts aren't, I think the guy at the end of the film has a good line about this, that it's not that they had, one side had a monopoly on facts, is that they understood the facts differently, you know, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, can I just respond to that? Right. So I'm a physics PhD, so I know a bit about the differences between fission and fusion, and I think that the reason why fusion power is so different than fission power is that fission power always wants to explode.
Oh no, I wasn't asking about the technicalities. I know the fusion power plant is further from the bomb than the fission power plant. It's about the emotional response, and I don't think that emotional response to the early days of the fission power was about necessarily about a good public understanding of the fact that could become a bomb, which you can't quite become a bomb, you can't go critical in the same way. So I mean, there's obvious technical reasons why I didn't work on this book. I'm just wondering why. Is it branding? Is it the fact that we're clearly so far from fusion power still that people aren't yet at the stage where they're going to panic about it? Because there's no one building it.
I think it's partly timing. At the time things like the H-bomb came out, nuclear weapons was a very big term that was thrown around a lot, and people understood it as, okay, this is a mushroom cloud, this is, you know what that is, that's nuclear fusion, that's the same thing as nuclear power. By the time fusion was introduced and became sort of more of a mainstream realistic, I mean, there's a saying, fusion is always less years off, right? But people associate fusion with things like, oh, that's what happens in the heart of the sun. Oh, that's a clean energy source. Oh, that doesn't make anything explode. Whereas fission, probably because of the time when it was introduced, I think, is more associated with, oh, that's the same thing that's in all those books. So,
which actually wasn't.
Well,
by the time people were really protesting.
Yeah,
I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
Has a lot of nuclear fission in it to provide the energy.
Yes, so I know about it. Yeah.
It's the fusion that does the.
But it's Putin, for instance, now if Putin destroys Manchester, it would be destroying it with fusion, not fission.
It's a happy thought, isn't it?
It's a happy thought. I'm not sort of
Nice sunny day outside.
Any further?
One last one, sorry. So there's a lot of young people in this room, in contrast to the movie. Are there any plans to do something about the future of nuclear with the
For me, everyone always asks me that. I kind of feel like I want to hand the baton to someone else, really, just because it's true that I remain like totally interested, and I would 100% go and watch someone else's film, the sequel to this one. But I think I've kind of I need to earn some money, really. Pay for this one. Equally, if somebody, you know, if someone
had the money,
if the BBC came to me tomorrow and said, "Will you make the sequel and we'll actually pay you to make," then I definitely would be interested in that. But I don't know. It's a hard, sort of slightly bonkers thing to make a film, a feature doc, I think. So yeah, I'll let somebody a bit younger with a bit more energy. The equivalent of me back in 2006 can do the next one.
See now one of them. Yeah, it was really good.
The question was the sort of pivotal moments of accidents at Fukushima, 3 Mile, Chernobyl, and not much on Windscale.
Well, I had a lot more on Windscale in an earlier version. it was one of the ones, I think, because it was not so well known, also just frankly because it was from a longer time ago. I didn't, you know, Tony Benn talked about it a little bit, about that he basically didn't really know about it. I did have a whole much longer sequence in there, but it felt a bit more, because the people who were telling me about it were basically historians. I had some nice archive footage of, there was great sort of newsreels of them pouring away all the milk. But there wasn't anybody, you know, I wasn't obviously able to interview anybody who was involved because nobody's still alive. And yeah, there were so many, you know, they taught in filmmaking this, you have to kill your babies, and Windscale was one. Another one that I kept in for such a long time. Marcel Boiteau, the EDF guy, I put this down as a question, like I said, I didn't do the interview because I just had my baby, but his apartment in Paris in the 70s was bombed by some like real militant anti-nuclear activists, and he was home with his wife and daughter, and the whole of the kind of sort of middle of the apartment just was blown up. And I just thought he probably won't want to talk about that, but it was so sort of extraordinary that I put it on the questions. And then he did talk about it, and he talked about it like it was just really fascinating. And I had that in there for such a long time because it was just incredibly interesting. But yeah, we had to make this decision to kind of keep France in storytelling wise just as the sort of pro-nuclear country, so it had to go. And I was yeah, that was another one. So yeah, somewhere there is a sort of shadow, well, there's a 6-part series I think in there somewhere, but I don't know, it just exists in my head I think at the moment. Yeah, but yeah, that's why really, but you're completely right, Windscales are totally another significant kind of pivot probably.
We probably have time for one short question, if anyone has it.
Have we had any online questions? We haven't answered anything.
No, there was
okay,
no
cool.
more. No, then I think we should thank our amazing person who was giving us all of this insight about the movie. Thank you so much for all of your time.
Thank you for having
and
me.
the stories. We probably should finish. So thank you for everyone for staying online. If there is any more questions, please let us know, and we'll make the video available to you soon.
Oh, I did just think of one other thing, if it's okay. I just wanted to plug, going on to talk about all my hundreds of interviews. I have put together some bonus bits of some of the interviews, I think about 6 of the interviews, and they're on my website for like 99p or whatever. But if you want to have a look, it's just the atomfilm.com, and there's like a shop page on there. But and yeah, and to tell people about the film as well. Like, I really, especially like you saying about young people, I'm really keen to get sort of younger audiences, because it does seem like for some reason, I don't know, nuclear seems to be more of a subject that sort of baby boomers are interested in, but younger people maybe don't it's not on their agenda maybe in the same way. So let's spread the word.